This is interesting. And we're live?
There we go. We are live.
Hey! There's 21 people here already. How good is that? Hey, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. And what a beautiful day for a lovely little webinar. Don't know where you're at, but here in Oslo, it's pouring down, it's grey, it's windy, it's not nice. So inside in front of your screen, much better. Anyway, welcome to all of you to this little webinar here for Enonic. We've got two presentations today, one about using Enonic in a headless fashion for Next.js and one about upcoming features in Content Studio. They're both about half-hour presentations each, so we'll be watching them as they go through. For any regulars here, my face might be new. I am a new hire here at Enonic. My name is Thomas Hartman, and I'm here as a developer advocate. That means that if you've got any questions, any feedback, whatever, feel free, come to me and ask me any questions. I'll try and play it forward and to make things easier for you. That's my job. Anything you want, come and talk to me. Hey, 33 people, still people coming in. Now, I hear some rumors that we might be people from, all over the world. So if you want to try out the chat function, feel free to just tell me where you're from. I'm in Oslo myself, and I think most of the team are here too. We'll see. Oh, also important, during the presentations, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and there's a little Q&A at the end of each presentation. So if you remember, there is a little way to mark your comment as a question. If you don't, it's no big deal. We can take care of it, but it makes it easier for us if you do. But anything you want to ask, just drop it in the chat. All right, 39 people. This is going well. Oslo, this is good. Also, now that we've got a couple minutes before we start, thank you to all of you who show up here today and for helping us make this a fun event and who keep on showing up time after time and make us what we are. Thanks also to all of the customers and especially to Nav this time for giving us honors and a nice little presentation, I'm sure. I've seen some small snippets of code and it seems to be very interesting. I'm quite intrigued with how they've got everything set up. So I guess lean back, have a coffee if you haven't. It's still early, I know. Still okay to sort of drag yourself out of bed and sit down. You don't have to look awake just yet. I do, you don't.
Coffee helps, that's true.
Coffee helps a lot. How many cups have you had today, Alan?
You don't want to know. And the day has just begun.
Yeah, it'll be a good one, I'm sure. All right, 44 people.
4 people already, oh my God.
Hey, we got people from Sonnefjord as well. That's nice.
Oh, it's like Eurovision, you know? Almost.
Ooh, so, which country are you, Alan?
The last time I checked, I was in Norway, based on the weather outside, at least. You get my 12 points, Thomas, today.
Yes. I didn't actually catch Eurovision, and I'm quite sorry for kind of sorry for it. I did, however, see the Italian one because I figured, we won. It'd be fun to check it out. And it's good. It's been a while. Last year, we had a couple of friends and I had this really, my friend loves Eurovision. So it was like this big hyped up event. We got dressed up and it was the day before May 17th. So come Constitution Day. None of us could do anything because we were all quite tired. It's been a long night.
Yeah.
But,
of course.
All right. But we've waited for about 5 minutes and we're 46 people now, so it's about time we get going. First out is Anders talking about Next.js and using Enonic in a headless fashion over at Nav. And let's just see how that goes. Anders, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, I'm just going to start my screen sharing here. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, I'm Anders. I'm a web developer at Nav. I'm going to demonstrate our headless Enonic XP setup with the Next.js frontend for our website at Nav.no. This looks something like this currently. Just some short facts about Nav. We're the Norwegian Labour and Welfare Administration. We handle about a third of the Norwegian state budget. That includes things like pensions, unemployment benefits, disability benefits, family and friend and children benefits, and helping people find jobs, things like that. We have about 19,000 employees ourselves. A little bit about our website at Nav.no. It's a very complex website served by hundreds of different applications, front-end and back-end. We get about 200,000 unique daily visitors on average. And we use Enonic XP as our main CMS for publicly accessible content. And on that, we get about 170K unique daily visitors. We have about 12,000 pages, a bit more than that, in our main CMS. There are about 1,000 content editors working on this. So why did we decide to go headless? Well, we've been using XP now for about a year and a half. We migrated from the old Enonic CMS in late 2019. So we've been using it for a while, but we didn't have a headless setup at that time. We used the built-in front-end functionality in XP. But we wanted to have a React front-end, so we could use React code for a few different reasons. One of them is our design system, which makes components for React, so it would be easier to integrate those in the front-end if we had a separate React front-end or some similar solution. Also, our front-end developers at Nav are generally well-versed in React, so it would be easier to find developers to work on it if we had a React-based front-end. And also, the issue of separation concerns, which arguably makes it easier to keep a tidy code base if you have a separate presentation layer. So we started prototyping after summer last year. We had the first working prototype late August, and we went into production in December. So it's been running there now for about half a year. So I'm just going to show a brief overview of our setup. We have, of course, Enonic XP. That's a headless CMS with the Guillotine library, which serves the content for our front end. This is hosted on a Linux virtual machine cluster. And we have our Next.js-based front end here. This is open source, so you can go and have a look if you're interested. We use static site generation and something called incremental static regeneration to keep our static HTML up to date. This is hosted on Nav's Kubernetes-based platform, which is called Nice, and it's very nice. So this front-end retrieves the content from this service in XP, which we call the SiteContent Service. And this does run on Kubernetes on multiple containers, so that's represented by these circles here. Because we're running on Kubernetes, we have also this little proxy app which handles the cache revalidation on every container. So when new content is published in XP, it sends a cache to this, it sends a call to this, which again calls all the containers in our front-end application to make sure the HTML cache is always updated. Now, Next.js does have its own functionality for handling cache revalidation, but it does have some weaknesses, so we need this little system here to sort of help it along. That is basically the overview of our architecture. So I'm going to spend some time now to look at the code. we're going to start with our Enonic XP application, which is here. Just start with a brief view of our Guillotine Schema, which is the GraphQL library used by the headless setup here. We do make some extensions to the schema because we need some extra processing on some of these content types and component types and macros even. We also have a few different auxiliary applications here, which we also include in the schema. So this is a fairly powerful thing to define these callbacks on the different types here. Yeah, this SiteContent Service here, this is where you actually retrieve the content. You can call this from the front end, which 2 parameters there, an ID, which is either a UUID of the content or a path, like this. And also you can specify a branch if you want to have the draft branch or the master branch. So this basically retrieves content from this function here. We also have caching on XP as well as the front end, because some of these queries to GraphQL can be fairly heavy. So it can take like a second or two on pages with a lot of references and things like that that needs to be resolved. So yeah, here we run the query to Guillotine. You can just have a look at how we put our query together. We basically have all these string templates here, which we merge together to one big string, basically. We just have a look at one of them. So basically queries like this. So we have on the different content types, we specify what data we want from each content type. And also the same for components. Here we specify, for parts here and layouts as well, pages, and also fragments, which require some extra attention. So we merge all this together to one giant query, really, which is thousands of lines long, but this approach works well for our setup. So basically here the front end doesn't do any direct queries to GraphQL, it just asks for this ID, and then the XP application handles the rest. To just do one call and you get whatever is located on an ID or a path. So I will basically just massage the data a bit. We parse some of this. You can get this data as JSON or config as JSON from Guillotine if you want to have like all the data from a content object. So we just parse this here with the function. We do some other massaging of component data here as well. This is a little bit complex, but we want to have basically put together a data structure that we want to use in our front end to make it as easy as possible to do the front end development. So and this returns all the finished content to the front end eventually. And if it doesn't find the content, we also have this redirect handler here, because there are some cases where you can get like a valid redirect even if there's no valid content for what we're asking. That is basically how we serve content to the front end. I was going to have a look at how we actually show this in the Content Studio, because of course we want to display this in the Content Studio as well, and not just to the public. So what we do here is in our page controllers. This is the same on all our page controllers, really. We use this central controller here, which we call the admin frontend proxy, which basically puts together a fetch call to our front end, retrieves the HTML, and displays that to the Content Studio. This generally works well with Next.js, with one exception. There are some assets in Next.js that are not served from absolute URLs, so we need to have this service here, which is, we have a mapping, a vhost mapping to this service, which retrieves all assets stored under this /_next. For those who are familiar with Next.js, you should recognize this, but this is basically the folder where it stores certain So that is how we handle pages for Content Studio. We also have another similar system for individual components, parts and layouts. We have this component preview controller here, which is also the same. We return from every part and every layout. What this controller does is it fetches it runs another query to fetch component fields, basically. And it sends these to the front end, to a service there in the front end, which retrieves the HTML for an individual component. So you can get like the immediately updated component view in the Content Studio. When you make changes to a single component, you don't have to refresh the whole page. So yeah, that's basically how our Content Studio integration works. These two controllers here. That is generally what, yeah, there isn't much more to say about our XP side of things. I'm going to have a look now at the front end, which is here. This is based on Next.js, of course. Just going to mention briefly how the routing works in Next.js. You have this pages folder here, which is where all the routing happens. It basically picks whatever the most specific controller here for the path that is requested. So if you request like this /no/RSS, it will serve our RSS from this controller here. Or similar, if you ask for something under these paths, it will serve from these special cases here. But generally, everything here happens through this path router here, which is this strange double bracket syntax. Basically means it's a catch-all thing. So it catches everything that isn't caught by something else that's more specific. And this is where we run our fetch code. And yeah, we return this. We can have a look at the fetch code as well. This does is it gets this controller here. It has the path that is requested. So it basically passes this to this fetch functionality here. So we do some checks here for if it's media content, it just redirect directly to the media content and not try to render a page from media content, or we handle some various errors and redirects. But if there's no special case, then it just returns the content. And this content is then passed to this page-based React component. Which again, we have this page wrapper here, which basically just sets some context for our header and footer, really. And there are some hooks for links and things like that here, and meta tags. But generally, it's this content mapper here where the magic happens. What we do here is basically we map the different content types to a React component. We have some special cases here, but most content types are rendered through this dynamic page, which basically means what this does is handles this as it handles the component tree, basically. So this is very simple. It's simply, as long as it has any valid regions in the page component, which is of course the root component of the XP component tree, it passes this to this component mapper here, which we'll have a look at. Which again uses, yeah, it checks the type of the component. You have this, I mean, you have in XP you have 6 different component types here. You have this text and image, which are very simple. They are exactly what they sound like, text and image. So it basically renders these things. We don't use these much really, but we have them here for compatibility. We also handle layouts. We handle layouts and pages the same way because for all intents and purposes, they are the same thing, at least as far as our front end is concerned. We can have another look here at the layout mapper. We really use the same pattern as in the content mapper. Basically, check the type, the descriptor of the layout, and maps that to a suitable React component. So for example, this, you can have a look at this. If it's a page with side menus layout type, it will render this component, which is a layout with an optional left and right menu and a content in the middle. And each of these has a region. And a region is where you can put more nested components. So this region, again, renders another component mapper. So now we're back here again. So it basically renders this recursively, the whole component tree. So this next component is this layout, for example. Again, a very simple layout here, which has maybe some parts in this region. So the component mapper again. Maybe the next component is a part. And here again, we use the same pattern. We map the descriptor for the part to, yeah, suitable React component. For example, this, which is a HTML area that you can use in Content Studio. You can also have a look at this HTML parser here. Right now we're in the process of upgrading from Guillotine 4 to Guillotine 5, so now we have some double compatibility here for both our Guillotine 4 HTML handling and the Guillotine 5, but we'll just have a look at the Guillotine 5 way of doing it. It does handle macros in a bit different way. So we have, we do some cleaning of the HTML here, remove empty things, and yeah. Basically, the most interesting part here is this macro handling. Checks if it has this editor macro tag, which is where the macros are defined. And it runs this macro mapper, which again uses this same pattern. It checks the name of the macro and picks out the props for that and renders it. So you might have a macro here for a blue button, which is button that's blue. And that's basically our whole rendering process here on the front end. It parses goes through the component tree from XP and just renders it recursively. Yes. Next, we can have a look at this. I mentioned this component preview we had in XP. You can have a look at this controller as well. This is where the preview gets its HTML from. It basically just renders this component mapper to static markup and returns that to Content Studio, the props that are provided. We also have this revalidator function, which I mentioned in this slide here. When content is published, it runs through this, and this hits this service here, which this is a bit of a hack, but it basically calls itself to trigger a regeneration of the page cache. Because the way the page cache works in Next.js, it basically, if we look at this page router here, if you specify this revalidate property, then it checks every specified 1 second. So every 1 second, if there's been more than 1 second since the last time it was revalidated and a request comes in on the page, then it triggers the revalidation. The problem with that is if you can sometimes end up in a state where you serve old content, especially when you're running on Kubernetes, because this only triggers on one pod. So that's why we need this this system here to update the cache on every pod. That was really the gist of it when it comes to front end. There are lots of things you could talk about when it comes to Next.js, but there are plenty of resources out there for that. So I'm just going to have a look now at our content studio to see how this works in practice. This is just my local instance, but this is fairly similar to what we have in production. This is our front page for employers. Looks like this at the moment. Let's see how this works on our editor. We don't really have many fields here on the content data. This is mostly just metadata. So all our content editing on our new content types is done with components. So we can use the drag and drop features here and place things wherever we want. And you can see here, if I make any changes to one of the components, it updates immediately. You don't have to refresh the page because of this component preview. So yeah, you can do whatever you want here, really. So yeah, this is a very there we go. This is a very flexible system. If you want to have a different layout on this, it's very easy to change it. If you have a look at some of our old templates, it was much more hard-coded, basically. So we were stuck with this data model be defined in our data here. Well, this is just a locked template. Also have a look at a different template that we're using, a new content type. This is the page with side menus that I showed earlier, which has this optional menus that also has regions. So you can drag and drop things in here if you want. Like if I want a button, I have my button. I can link to, let's say, the English version. This is also updated in real time, so you don't have to refresh the page to see any changes here. Yes, that is basically what I have. So, are there any questions?
Yeah, that's great. Very interesting. We do have two questions that have popped up in the chat, and we'll do them in the order they came in. The first one is from Espen H, and the question is, let's say you have one stray character in one of the query fragments that you join together. When the join query is not valid, what does the debug output look like? Is it hard to figure out which of the fragments have the stray character or the messed up query?
It varies. It can be difficult, but we do have some error logging here on the query. Let's see. So we basically just print out the GraphQL errors. They're usually relatively easy to understand, but it can be some cases if you have like a more serious error, you can get a wall of text of errors. So that can be a challenge. But the one positive aspect of building the query purely on the XP side is you don't get the risk of the front end sending an invalid query. So it doesn't happen very often. We catch these sort of errors before we reach production, really, because we notice things like that locally. So this hasn't really been a problem for us.
Interesting. Next up, there's one from Pesine, Quackerboom, and he asks, how does the Content Studio controller call the Next.js frontend? Do you have a service that calls the Next.js endpoint?
Can you repeat that? Or can I maybe read it?
Yeah, if you've got it there, it's from Pesine. It's just the second question.
I see. How does the Content Studio controller? Yeah. You can see the Content Studio gets its HTML from these page controllers for each page type. So what these page controllers do, they export, all of them export this same controller here. admin frontend proxy. And this controller calls the frontend. It builds the frontend URL here. So it gets a response, and if it's a valid response, then it returns that. So everything happens through this, and this basically calls the frontend directly. Or more specifically, it has a special /draft controller here, which has some slight differences from this other one, but we basically don't use cached HTML here. That's the only real difference. And we have a authentication key as well, because we don't want the whole world to see our unpublished content. So yeah, but it basically happens through the page controllers, goes through that and calls the front end.
Great.
Does that answer the question?
I assume so. There's another one from Espen here. The Next.js app, is it running the preview in Content Studio?
Yes.
It is.
Does show the Next.js app in Content Studio. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what happens to these page controllers. So.
Nice. Right. Mark asks whether there is a reason you use TypeScript in the backend, or in the front end, but not in the backend.
Yeah, it's basically because the front end is, well, newer. We made it from scratch, and we wanted TypeScript, so we used TypeScript there from day one. While the Enonic XP app is a bit older, and at least I don't think there was TypeScript possibility when we started on that application, although that was a bit before my time, so I can't say for sure, but I think that's probably the reason. But although we are actually exploring the possibility of converting our XP application as well to TypeScript. We're having a look at this TypeScript library that the previous webinar presenter showed. That's actually working fairly well. So we have some small details to work out there, but I think we're gonna use that eventually.
Yeah, that's great. That was Tom Arrell's presentation last time. That's good. Now, one more question, at least from Bobby. The question is, might be too technical, but how do you fetch and add assets, JavaScript, for the front end for each part being added in Page Editor? I'd assume you rely on page contributions, but those don't reload, refetch when you click apply, or perhaps are not needed for your setup.
Assets for the front end. You mean like in the Content Studio when you're using that, or like when you add a part here, like how this process works? This all happens through this let's see, this component preview controller here. You can see on all our parts and layouts, they export this, which calls a service in the front end. What this does is it retrieves the component through its own query, really, which fetches all the component fragments there, and it basically sends a request to the front end to this component preview API endpoint, which is this one, and this renders the component that you asked for in XP and returns the HTML for it. So this is what happened in Content Studio. When it comes to normal requests to the front end, that's simply, yeah, you include all the parts in the page tree, really, in the component tree. So it just renders it recursively. So you get all the components in the initial request. So you don't have to do any extra requests for every component or anything like that. Maybe just look at the request there just to see how it works. I mean, you get this, the text in my Postman here might be a bit small, but you get this page tree here, which basically has a nested tree of every component, every region. So this is used to render our component tree. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, at least from what I can tell. Now, there's two questions. We're running good time, so we might want to do them quite quickly. Mark asks, how does this perform compared to a more traditional implementation that is using time-leaf rendering? Do you know if there's a difference there?
Yeah, we did do some performance tests after we went in production, and the response times did go down a little bit. So even the initial requests from XP was, yeah, I believe it's slightly faster in our use case at least. And also Next.js is it is a single page application, so after initial load it is very fast, since it does, like, while this loaded, it also cached everything behind every link, so everything happens very quickly.
Wow, that's really really cool.
You get the very like application feel, I think. And this is not locally, this is the actual website.
Nice.
This is an application, so it's slightly slower.
Okay, so final question then from Morten. Can you show an article? Is it built the same way as landing pages with components?
Yes, an article. You mean, yeah, our articles still use our, well, call it a legacy content type, which we had in our initial, I think this actually existed since the old Enonic CMS implementation we had. So this does not use components in the same way. It does technically use parts, but it gets all its data from the data object, basically. So it doesn't have individual components there. You only have a hard-coded data model, really, where you can define certain components here that you want to appear with checkboxes and things like that. Just have a look here. So everything on these legacy types is really stored in the data object. While the page object doesn't have any independent components.
Great.
But we are looking at making new versions of these articles as well that uses the component system, but we're basically doing one thing at a time. So most of the content on our website still use these old article content types.
All right, cool. And I think that's about what we got time for right now. There's maybe a yes or no question here from Thomas asking whether they're using page templates. So if you've got a quick question or a quick answer, we'll do it. If not, I think we're going to have to press on.
Yes, we are using page templates.
Great.
We have some, yeah, basically, we do.
All right. Well, in that case, I think we're going to have to move on. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and great to see, really exciting to see how you use it in conjunction and the editing experience and how it changes. So,
yeah, you're right. Thanks for having me.
Anytime.